Hi, and welcome to the Green Innovation Group podcast, where we talk about, as always, decarbonizing the healthcare sector. And today's episode is one I'm really excited about, where we have Nikoline coming, who's an expert in green and sustainable laboratories, which in a way is a big part of the foundation for what ends up going on in treatment and in drug development everywhere. And in this episode, we will come into and talk about why it is important that labs become more sustainable. Can it actually be done? What are the barriers and what can you get out of doing it? So listen along. I'm really excited about this episode. Welcome, Nikoline. I really look forward to having this conversation with you about sustainability in labs, which I think is really a hidden gem in all of sustainability. There's so much of the stuff that we use every day that has an origin in a lab somewhere in the development journey. And of course, especially in our focus area in Green Innovation Group in healthcare, labs are simply essential. Everything from where the drug is conceived, tested, the clinical thing, to all the tests that are going out in the hospitals as part of procedures every day. And I think it's fairly safe to say that sustainability currently is pretty much a non-factor in most labs. But that probably needs to change. So welcome. That's good. That's a good starting point that we agree on that. So welcome, Nikoline. And I'm curious, what has been your own journey into working with sustainable labs and being passionate about that?
Yeah, good question. Where does the journey start? So I studied biochemistry at the University of Copenhagen, and then I just knew I liked working in labs, so I thought I'm just going to do a PhD because I don't know what I would like to do if not a PhD. Yeah. And then it was really during my PhD that the whole climate agenda really hit me full speed, and I realized that...
What was the PhD about? I probably wouldn't understand. But,
so I did my PhD at the Center for Protein Research, and for many people they're like, okay, proteins, beef, workout, things like that. Yeah. But that's not.
It was not conflicting.
No, that's not what we did all day. So proteins are responsible for many activities in our bodies, and we were studying the proteins that are involved in recognizing DNA damage and also repairing DNA damage. So basically, it's basic research, but with implications for both cancer, but also cancer treatment and different diseases associated with DNA damage. So that's more or less what I did my PhD in, like overall. So very different, nothing to do with sustainability or climate or environment.
Was it present in your mindset at this time?
And then it became very present somehow, and I can't really say why. I'm guessing it's also, I think the whole Fridays for Future and all of this that suddenly just blew up and it was everywhere. Not in action, but in words.
In awareness, at least.
Yeah, and then I think, if you've ever entered a bioscience lab, you will know that it generates a lot of waste, an incredible amount of waste, especially single-use plastics, of course.
What does a lab look like? Which activities goes on? Could you, if you had to describe it to a blind person or someone who's never been there?
Yeah, that's a difficult one.
Give it some texture.
Now I'm like, okay, what are the words and the things that everybody knows, and what are the things that you know because of your background? But basically, if you can say basically, we mix a lot of things in a lot of plastic items, and then we analyze these things with instruments. That's like the very short thing, right?
That's a good description.
And in chemistry labs, you deal with chemistry only. In bioscience labs, you have chemistry and maybe human samples or animal samples.
So that would be a blood sample or a tissue sample?
Or cells. In many labs, like in the labs that I worked in, we used cells derived from animals or humans back in the days, like cancer cells, because they keep growing and dividing and growing and dividing. So it is, in a way, human, but it's so it's maybe 50 years since it came out of a human.
That's also interesting.
Yeah, I mean, some people really are living eternally in a way in labs all over the world. It's
as
very
a cancer
weird.
cell in a petri dish. Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. So
then
careful
we analyze,
if you wish for eternal life.
Yeah, exactly.
It might not be all you thought it was. Yeah.
Exactly. And then, for example, we use these cancer cells to analyze what would happen if we did this, or what happens if we induce this kind of damage, or all of these things. Yeah. And then we analyze that by use of a lot of different single-use plastic things, a lot of chemicals and reagents, a lot of instruments, and a lot of airflow also to keep us safe. So that's like a very unusual environment. It's not like an office at all.
And you, during your PhD, a realization crept into you that the procedures in the labs, the whole organization setup of things were not sustainable, or could at least be better.
Yeah, I think first of all it started with me doing a lot of things in my private life where I felt like I really had to do something.
Yeah.
And then it felt really weird that in my private life I was doing a lot of things to reduce my own climate impact. And then when I entered the door to the university and my lab, I simply had to like ignore my values and these things that were important to me, because it felt like it's impossible to be green in here, because like where do I even start? And then I was like, but maybe let's just start somewhere.
That's usually a powerful step to take action. I think it's just really, really interesting to just stop at that it felt like such an enormous task that perhaps it couldn't even be done. I think that a lot of people are sitting in a similar situation in whatever area they're in.
And that goes for so many things. Like if you would build a house, that's also an incredible project. You're like, where do I even start? But then you ask people who know how to start building a house, or you make someone build that house. And it's the same with going green in the lab or anywhere. I would say we do have the knowledge for everything. Now it's maybe not easy to start, but
is that you would say that we have the knowledge to do a lot of things?
For sure. Lab-wise, we do.
So what was your journey? How did you start? And how did you start making that shift of, also being more aligned with your own values in your work life?
So I started small and with obvious things, and that's probably what most people do, like things that are not necessarily the most impactful things, but the things that mean the most to you. And I think for many lab users, it's the plastic waste that means the most to them, because it's very obvious, and plastic is let's call it a hot topic. It's something we discuss a lot. So that's also where I started. So whenever I could reuse single-use plastic items, I would. If I could avoid single-use plastic, I would.
Would you would wash the plastics, or just use it a second time if it didn't matter? Or?
Both. And of course, like every time we speak reusing plastic, it really depends on the situation. So it's always up to the lab user to evaluate, is this going to compromise my work? Because then don't do it. It's much greener to discard one single-use plastic item than to discard a whole experiment. But it's always up to the lab user to evaluate, is this doable? And for a lot of the things that I was doing, it didn't have to be sterile or ultra clean. So I could directly reuse certain things, and other things could be washed in between. Sometimes you can even just downsize, so use a smaller tube, a smaller petri dish, things like that.
Yeah, for the same thing. And that brings me to a question that in healthcare, for instance, you have the governing principles that it has to be safe for the patient, it has to be efficient. And then there's also a cost component, of course, so that everybody can get the treatment that they should. Are there like 2 or 3 governing principles for lab users that is the frame for sustainability that still has to work in order to do the work properly? And
I mean, I think it's important to never compromise the work. Right? Regardless if it's teaching or research, or you're doing, for example, at the Department of Forensic Science, obviously they play an important role for like solving police cases, or at the hospitals solving things. Like obviously it should never compromise the work that you're doing. But I think the key is really that we can have the same output but with a smaller input. That's the whole key. It's not that we have to change our idea of what good quality lab work is.
That's a really, really interesting point. And it's a point I see in so many of the projects we're doing. I mean, whether it's in production or in supply chain or out in the commercial departments of the pharma and medtech companies, that it's quite often you're faced with this where sustainability interfaces, it's going to compromise what we're doing. We cannot do this. This is another thing on top. We're not going to be able to reach our business goals or quality criteria, whatever it is. And in so many cases, it's definitely doable. I was speaking to our procurement executive from one of the large healthcare systems recently that out of 20 sustainability projects that they did, only 2 of them had a higher cost. And they had taken them on because the CO2 emissions were so massive, so it was okay that they had a higher cost. But the other 18 initiatives were cost comparable. Yeah. Sorry, that was a disappointment.
But
I just think
I think that's a super relevant thing to mention also. And I think in labs, very often you will see that, like, basically it's just being a minimalist about things. Like that really is the key word.
But there will be if our listeners had to take just one thing away from today, is that you can achieve the same outcome, and the key is to be a minimalist.
Yes, exactly. So just, I mean, I know it can be difficult to look at the same protocol with new eyes, but science is about new ideas and testing new things. So I think we can do this. Yeah. So looking at the thing you've done 100 times and be like, could I do this in a smaller volume? Yeah. Could I do this with fewer samples because the samples are simply better? Yeah. Things like that. And if you're a minimalist, then you already dealt with the largest part of the climate footprint then. Because of course, the most green thing would be to stop doing anything in the labs. Yeah. But that's not going to happen. Right? No, so the second best is that we use as little of everything as possible.
Yeah, and I mean, we need the labs. We need to grow alternative protein sources. We need to find new production methods and all these things. So, if you zoom out, labs and biochemistry is a key component in solving a lot of the challenges.
And I think it's very ironic somehow that not for all labs, but for most of the labs, especially those that I work with, like there are 2 agendas that they work towards, right? So one is improving human health, and the other one is understanding nature better or making biotechnological solutions to make the planet greener. And while doing those things, they are ruining the planet, right? That's large words, but I mean, they study nature and destroy nature, and the people in the health, they are trying to improve health, but climate change is the greatest threat to human health. Definitely. So it's like ethically, it also doesn't make sense that we don't do anything about the labs.
No, definitely. In the healthcare system, I've called it sometimes expanding the Hippocratic oath, that doctors, when they get educated, they swear this oath, that first principle, do no harm.
Exactly.
And I think we need to include the planet in that. So this came through your PhD, and then what happened in the journey after that? You got the awareness, you started small.
Yeah, then I tried to sort of, of course it's great if an individual does something, but I mean, movements can really change the world. It's hard for an individual to do that, right? So I tried to somehow get more people on board. So like in my own lab group, we had like a reuse table where you could put up if there was anything, could be reagents, could be plastic items that you reuse. And then at some point I was thinking, I think it would actually be really like a lot of fun if we had a center initiative, like a group of people dealing with green stuff internally at the center to try to simply be just a little more sustainable. I mean, science is never going to be sustainable, but at least let's get closer. And then I took the initiative to that, and then a lot of people responded. I just sent one of these emails.
Yeah.
And
bold move.
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah.
Well, I asked our director first if I had his blessing, and he thought it was an amazing idea. Thank goodness. And then a lot of people actually responded and really thought it was a great idea. And somehow I think that's also very, very general for lab users, that there are definitely green lab users out there, but I think all of them feel alone. They're all like, I feel like I'm the only one caring about this. And it's really, really strong when you know that you're not the only one. And I think that was really wonderful to see that there are many people who are like, I like the work that I do, I think it's meaningful, I just don't like the footprint that it leaves behind on the planet. Then it sort of just took off from there, where we did things, and it's not that we changed the world or anything, but we started small, and it's also in the beginning very much about awareness. And then at some point I just knew that, I mean, I like science, I like research, but I think the most important agenda I have to work on is the climate and the planet. So I resigned from my postdoc and thought, I'm just going to give it a go. Like the worst thing that can happen is either I don't think it's fun to work with green labs or I can't live from it. And then I'll just take a normal job. I mean, that's not so bad.
Also not a pretty bold move.
Maybe.
So that's the status today as well, that you are working full-time and solely with making labs greener, which I think is incredible and unfortunately still quite unique.
Unfortunately.
I hope you will take this the right way, but I hope you get a lot of competitors, I hope Green and Racing Group gets more and more competitors, because it's really needed.
I mean, if we need to change the whole industry, it takes more than a handful of people.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned that some of the green lab users, they felt alone. I think and this is me asking because I'm not knowing, how is the social structures inside the labs? Do people mostly work alone solely at a specific station, or is it teamwork, or do you eat lunch with the same people who use your labs? And because I mean, we'll talk about this more in another episode, how to actually drive the change, but at the end of the day, we are social animals. So what's the atmosphere like in a lab?
I think that differs a lot. I mean, you can have two neighboring labs that are completely different.
Interesting.
So in one lab, they go out for Friday beers every Friday. In the other lab, they can't agree what radio station they want to hear, and that's why there's just passive aggressiveness all over the room. So labs are extremely different. Just to clarify, I'm sure there are also people who do feel alone in their work, because some people also work very much alone on a project. In my experience, all the things that I have done have been in collaboration with others, so I never felt alone in that sense. But I think the green scientist mindset,
exactly.
in that you can feel very much alone.
Yeah, that's a good clarification.
Also because I think that's maybe also the drawback of a health sector in general, that you're already doing good.
Yes.
So you have a carte blanche to leave whatever footprint behind you want. And that's really also a mentality in much of the health science going on, or the research.
It's throughout the whole healthcare industry. There is a fundamental change that needs to happen in that mindset. And thankfully it is happening, and it's coming really fast at the moment. But it's been an excuse for very long that hey, we're saving human lives. What more could you ask for? And then we'll not talk about the 8, 10, 12 million people who dies of air pollution each year and so on.
Exactly. And I think that is just really still the standard mentality in many labs. So it is the odd one out, the odd ones out that are the green ones, but that's also changing.
Like you said, more and more of us are making initiatives in our private lives. All the good ones, commuting better, eating less meat, and so on. And I think and I hope that creates some natural pressure on the labs as well.
And then I can also see a generation thing. I don't feel super old. I also don't feel super young. But I can see, I can see, for example, master students now. I feel like I was just a master student, but really I wasn't, right? But they are just they are much more passionate about this than my generation was, right? And they are really gonna change a lot of things.
And that's super interesting as well for, also for the healthcare systems, but especially for the private companies, because we definitely see that as one of the key motivations as well, that this is a requirement from the talent mass. The newly graduates that are coming out there simply not willing to work for non-green companies.
Exactly.
And of course, that's on a larger scale with maybe avoiding petrochemical companies and so on. But it's also when you're deciding between different pharmaceutical companies.
Yes.
Are these aligned with my values or not?
Yeah.
So there's, once again, we are back to that there are key business reasons for doing this as well.
For sure.
We can talk about cost later, but I think it's a fairly uncontroversial statement that in the long term, a pharmaceutical company's success is in large part dependent on the talent that it has.
For sure. It is going to be a selling point in a very short time.
And I think it already is.
Yeah.
So what is the status today out there in the labs?
Yeah, there's a positive spin and a negative spin, maybe. So the positive is there's room for improvement. And if you're in this area of business, you will have something to do for a long time. The not so great spin is, whoa, it's a long way to go. Because, mentality-wise, there's a lot to change. And that's the most impactful and the most wonderful when it's about people, in my opinion. But it's also so difficult to change. It's not just turning off or on a button. It's really the way we think about our work. I think it's also very much about actually prioritizing it from the top. So I want to say I think it's depressingly unsustainable at the moment, even in companies where I'm like, you definitely have the money to go green in 3 years. Honestly.
Wow, such a short timeline.
Because I mean, I think no labs can ever be sustainable. Honestly, it can never be a zero sum. But it really isn't rocket science to go green in a lab. It's about deciding to go for it and actually prioritize it, and not just thinking about it or talking about it or describing ideas, but actually carrying them out.
The average lab that you meet, where are they today? And I'm not talking about maybe some green niche lab in Novo or Gubra who are further ahead, but you're like the average lab that you see. What is there even an awareness among the users? I think very often there is an awareness among the users, but not among all users. But I think in any lab, or in every lab, there will always be a few people who are like, we could do this smarter. And then I think very often there's also a gap between people making decisions and people who get the good ideas, because the lab users have the best ideas about how to make their work more efficient, or how to. Sometimes there's also a huge overlap in health and safety and the green things, right? Which is it's ideal in so many ways, but it's not until you put the health and safety on top of it that people listen to it, or like people with management. That's interesting,
right? So that's also like a nice trick when they're trying to sort of advocate for green things. Like if you can find any good reason in terms of health and safety, then remember to mention that, because that makes a difference.
And that's really nice as well, because I mean, all the EHS officers, environmental health and safety out there, that I know so many green passionate people in the pharmaceutical industry that has been in environmental health and safety roles for 10 years, going in there thinking, now I'm going to do something for the green transition. And it ended up being 90% health and safety and 10% green stuff. And thankfully that's changing now. But I really like the idea of like using it as a jiu-jitsu move to from a lever. And in general, I think that's, in general for the green transition, I think it's a good point you have, that the more you can work through existing agendas, that this is not something that we're putting on top. And
it's not compromising any of the other agendas. It's supporting them, right? I think there are so many good examples where doing the greener or taking the greener way in the lab is also good money-wise, health-wise, or just a good lab practice or whatever.
Yeah, and especially as well that, I mean, especially the pharmaceutical industry is also an interesting place in the sense that there's a really, really, really long way between the first tests and clinical trials and even the foundation before you actually start clinical trials, and then a drug hitting the market. So there's also these massive lock-in effects where if a drug is tested in a specific way, ends up being approved in the end, the FDA or other medical authorities in a specific way, because the clinical trials were made in a specific way, and then that's how we produce it. And then, I think a lot of lab users might underestimate the power that they have, because even if they're in a very early stage in the development and it's not at scale, they are influencing the scale production that is going to be locked in for 10, 15, 20 years on how we're producing this. And as soon as it's out and it's approved, it's so hard to change and go back.
Exactly. Yeah, just how you store things, right? For example, now also with vaccines and everything, like -80, -70, all of these things, like just Like if you can store things at just minus 75 instead of minus 80, it makes a huge difference energy-wise. And but maybe convenience is telling you to do minus 80 because that's what you have, right? And then in the next 40 years, this drug will be stored at this...
Exactly, and there's a lot of these things where we're coming from a mindset in the pharmaceutical sector where, again, safety and efficiency, that's the key. So we would rather overdo something than not do it. It has to be super sterile, has to be super cold. And the fact of the matter is that most things don't have to be to that extreme.
No.
Like some kind of sterile might be. Maybe there are even parts that don't have to be sterile. Every single component don't necessarily have to be packaged differently. Like you said, the energy expenditure between cooling something to minus 80 and minus 75 is vastly different.
Yeah. Exactly.
And it affects the whole supply chain later, because then you have to move it through the cold chain. And you mentioned vaccines, so you also have these spin-off problems then that with the cooling, for instance, that a lot of countries in the global south don't have the infrastructure to keep things cooled and stored.
Yeah, so there's also an inequality aspect to it.
Yeah, definitely. Sure. This is super interesting, and we could talk for a long time, and thankfully we shall, because there's another episode coming up. But just to recap, you're working with this full-time when creating sustainable labs, and the good news for everyone listening out there is that it's definitely possible to do sustainable labs, maybe even within a 3-year timeline. We have the knowledge, we have the products.
Maybe not the products.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Looking forward
but
to...
But the way we use the products, there's a lot
a good
of potential there.
Yeah. And like you said, of course, I mean, we're probably not going to have regenerative labs ever.
Maybe also not sustainable.
Maybe not even sustainable, but we can get a lot better. And the key thing is to make it a priority and adopt a minimalist approach and understanding that the change has to happen through the lab users. Super exciting, Nikoline. And we're going to do another episode on how to make this change out in the real world and what can be done and what kind of benefits can come from it. Do you have anything last you want to say?
I think you summed it up really well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And if someone is sitting out there listening that, hey, this sounds interesting, where do they find you?
So I can be found on my website, so www.avasustain.com, so avasustain.com, and there you can find my contact info. I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Excellent.
Instagram for the younger generation that like to get green tips in their.
You have an Instagram account on sustainable labs? Yeah. Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, with easy to apply tips for any lab user. Yeah.
It's probably a good lever for impact. I don't have an Instagram account myself, but
you're missing out.
I don't think I would be able to control it. But thank you so much, and looking forward to have you in another episode.
Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much for listening in to this episode on Green Labs with me, Joachim from Green Innovation Group, and Nikoline. If you want to hear more episodes, you can find them on Spotify and wherever you find your other episodes. And feel free to comment on LinkedIn and let us know how it was and if there's anything we should do different or do more of. See you out there.